The reason I chose this question is because I'm not really that fond of my own art style at the moment. When I animate, I usually like to do it digitally, but recently, after years of drawing almost exclusively on my iPad, I found that I much prefer painting physically in my sketchbook again. I felt I needed a drastic change to my animation techniques, so I decided to work with as unconventional physical materials as possible. I'm hoping that by choosing this question, I will learn new skills from having to adapt to those techniques, whether it be stylistic elements or ways of working. The first experiment I did was the most simple. I put up stickers around Edinburgh, photographed them, and then compiled them into an animation. I was inspired by the sort of messy stickers and graffiti I see around Leith. I decided on a design for the text, drew it out on a piece of paper, then using a light box I traced it multiple times onto some sticker paper. I then cut these out and went about sticking them around Leith. I made sure to choose already graffiti saturated areas so that I would be less of a pain in the arse to whoever has to clean it. The reason I wanted to do this was to incorporate real-world textures into animation. I think this would work really well for interesting backgrounds for an animation. I usually never finish my own backgrounds for my own films, so I think this is something I could possibly incorporate going forward. I chose to keep the subject the same and have the visual interest come from the changing backgrounds, but it could also work if the background stayed the same and my stickers were the moving animation. I could place the stickers on something that already resembles a setting, for example, paint that is peeled into two-tone to replicate the floor and sky. Of course, the sticker frames would probably have to be small so they can be stuck in public, and easily peelable so that they could be replaced by the next frame, or removed afterwards if need be. They don't have to be placed in public, but for me that's the most interesting part about this experiment. I consider this test a success. It was fast and easy to do, and now I find myself looking out for interesting textures whenever I'm outside. I wanted to animate with cardboard because I'd made cardboard cutouts for a previous course and thought it was lots of fun. Much like the sticker test I did. The appeal of the cardboard cutout was partly that I could integrate the subject into the real world. The other reason to try this was the scale factor. Most of my experiments have got to be quite small for one reason or another, so I wanted to make my cardboard girl either life-size or larger. I made my reference animation digitally and drew out the frames onto various types of cardboard and painted her using acrylic paint. For the hair, I used thinner card, as thick cardboard is so difficult to cut with detail. There's 2 hair pieces for each frame, one to go behind her and one to go in front. To be honest, this experiment was very annoying. It was really hard to copy the hair from my draft animation onto card, and it took so long to cut out all the pieces and to paint them. I didn't use anything like carbon paper to transfer on the images as it was too big, so I had to constantly keep comparing the hair pieces to make sure they were the same shape and size. This test was a success, but I think it would be incredibly difficult to sustain an entire film in this style. What I think would work is, instead of having the subjects made of cardboard cutouts, I could build cardboard cutout sets for a background, photograph that, and then animate on top either digitally or with paper. This would be time consuming, but I think it would have a really unique look to it. I could even do the opposite of this test and use pixelation for a real world effect on a cardboard background. Cardboard is so easily acquired for free, so the only cost would be the paint that I use. My thermal print experiment was by far the easiest and simplest experiment. Instead of doing a reference animation, I did the entire experiment digitally. I have a receipt printer that can print images with a really nice almost half-tone texture. All I really had to do for this one was to print the frames using the receipt printer and then take photos of the print, which is where the physical aspect comes in. This could very easily be done digitally with filters or overlays, but what I like about actually printing off the frames is that each frame has its own texture to it, and the texture and tone of the frame is unpredictable. The drawbacks here are that the frames themselves are physically small, about the width of a receipt, so detailed animations can't be made really, or the subject will get lost in the textures. It's very cheap to do because the receipt printers can be bought for about £10 and the paper refills are also really cheap. The printer only produces black and white images, but these can be coloured in with markers, and there is different colour receipt paper available. I think a full animation, a simple one maybe, could be very easily made with this method. I think this was a success, but I didn't really take much of a risk here. My next experiment was my favourite. It's a risograph printed animation made from 6 printed frames. The risograph is a branded digital duplicator, aka a weird printer from Japan. Its purpose is high volume printing, usually for newspapers or art prints. Risograph prints have this texture to them that I was really drawn to. It's almost like a half tone. With risograph prints, you can only print one colour at a time and you have to make stencils of each colour you want. But instead of a physical stencil, the Riso stencil is an image that is scanned for the printers to duplicate. These stencils are known as the masters. I made a draft animation in Procreate, then for each frame I separated my subject into her different colours. The master should be in black and white. The value of the master is directly proportional to the value of the colour chosen for each section. So for example, if the master is a pale grey and you are printing in blue, the blue will be a pastel baby bluish colour. I laid out my frames onto one composition. The machine can only produce multiple copies of one image. Each colour had to be scanned and printed separately. I started with the lightest. The ink for each colour has to be loaded manually, and it's recommended not to use a lot of different colours for a print. Once I had finished printing my 4 colours, I took photos of them and compiled them into an animation in After Effects. My Risograph tutor allowed me to take prints from the scraps bin, where the other students had layered their test prints over and over the same piece to save resources. I use this as a background for my animation. I would say this test was successful. I really enjoyed the process of making this animation and would definitely try Risograph printing again. However, I think I'll probably use it for still prints. I'm a big fan of how the animation looks, but I think this could probably be replicated digitally with a filter or a texture or a brush for a whole lot less effort. My last experiment was lino printing. I knew this would be a hassle from the moment I decided to do it, and I was not wrong. I'd never tried lino printing before, so I bought a tiny slab of lino to practice on. It was so much more difficult than anticipated. The lino I'd got was incredibly hard, so it took a lot of effort to dig into it with the scalpel. It took me actual hours to produce a tiny A6 carving. I cut myself multiple times and I made a huge mess of shavings on our carpet. At this point I was feeling potential regret, but I still had to test if my print would actually print. I used 3 different consistencies of acrylic paint: watery, normal and thick. The thick result was by far the best. I was quite happy with the results. I'd only botched a tiny portion of the carving. For my actual frames, I chose a much softer linoleum to carve, which was so much faster to use. Again, my frames were drawn digitally and then printed out. I only used 2 frames for a very basic animation because I knew this one would take me forever. I still didn't have any carbon paper, so I took the printed frames, smeared charcoal all over the back, and then traced onto the lino. I actually really liked the textures that this made, both on the lino and the back of the paper, and I thought that would make a good animation by itself. I then spent a good few hours carving up my frames. Despite taking so long, I found it quite fun. The softer lino was definitely a good idea. But when it came to printing, there was lots of trial and error as, again, I used acrylic paint. I didn't have access to any lino ink and the acrylic worked okay last time. But this time, instead of chunky paint, I found that a watery black worked the best. The result was a little messy, so I cleaned it up a smidge and coloured it digitally so you could clearly see what was happening. I think this test was semi-successful. The animation itself I think looks good, but this technique is probably the most difficult to incorporate into a full-scale film. If I were to use lino for any aspect of a longer film, it would just take way too long. However, I will be using lino again just for printmaking. I think the results of my experiment are mostly subjective, but I made a rating system in an attempt to objectively rank them. I took all the qualities I was looking for in a successful experiment and marked them out of 5, with the most successful score possible being 35. I think personally my Riso animation was the most useful to me compared to my goals. Not only did I learn a new technique and machine, but it also benefited me artistically. I had to think more purposefully about values and colour palette when making this animation, and I was restricted to a limited palette. I think both of these things are a good exercise in finding a solid style for my final film. The cardboard experiment was also incredibly useful in that before now I couldn't figure out how to use After Effects for the life of me, but I had to learn how to use its features and tricks to compile the cardboard animation. Overall, I feel a whole lot better about my films going forward compared to my prior methods. I feel these experiments gave me a level of confidence about my future works that I didn't have before.